April 1943, North Atlantic. Lieutenant Commander Harold Morrison stands in the conning tower of USS Archer, a Fletcher-class destroyer cutting through 12-foot swells at 28 knots. His sonar operator just called out a contact. Range 3,200 yards. Bearing 047. Morrison grips the rail. Every instinct tells him to turn hard to port and drop depth charges. That's doctrine. That's training. That's what keeps American ships alive in these wolf-infested waters. But Morrison hesitates. What he doesn't know is that the enemy submarine commander hunting him has already fired. 2 torpedoes are racing toward Archer at 46 knots, and the decision Morrison makes in the next 40 seconds will either save his crew or prove that everything the U.S. Navy taught him about submarine warfare is catastrophically wrong. The North Atlantic in 1943 is a killing ground. German U-boats have sent over 2,800 Allied merchant ships to the bottom since 1939. The convoys that keep Britain alive cross 3,000 miles of open ocean, where a single torpedo can erase 10,000 tons of fuel, food, or ammunition in minutes. American destroyers like Archer are the shield. Their job is simple on paper: find the submarines before the submarines find the convoy. Standard tactics follow a clear pattern. When sonar picks up a contact, you charge straight at it. You increase speed to maximum, usually around 30 knots. You close the distance as fast as possible. You drop depth charges set to detonate at 150 feet, then 200 feet, then 300 feet. You saturate the area with explosives until the U-boat either surfaces or dies. The doctrine has been refined through 3 years of brutal experience. It works. Ships survive. Submarines sink. Except when it doesn't work. And increasingly, it doesn't. Here's the problem nobody wants to admit in the spring of 1943. U-boat commanders have figured out the pattern. They've fought enough engagements to recognize American destroyer behavior. They know the ships always turn toward the sonar contact. They know the destroyers always accelerate to maximum speed. They know the heading will be direct, aggressive, textbook perfect. And they know the time between initial sonar detection and the first depth charge drop is roughly 4 minutes, sometimes as little as 3 minutes if the crew is experienced. So German submarine captains do something brilliant and vicious. They don't fire their torpedoes at where the destroyer is when detected. They fire at where doctrine says the destroyer will be in 90 seconds. They calculate the intercept course. They aim at the predictable attack run. They exploit the fact that American aggression has become American predictability, and destroyers keep steaming straight into the trap following a playbook the enemy has memorized. If you're enjoying this deep dive into naval tactics, hit that subscribe button. We bring you the innovations that changed warfare every single week. By April 1943, the U.S. Navy has lost 43 destroyers and destroyer escorts in the Atlantic theater. Not all of them fall to this specific tactic. Mines claim some, aircraft claim others, mechanical failure and weather take their share, but enough ships explode during active submarine hunts that patrol commanders start noticing a disturbing pattern. Vessels that aggressively prosecute sonar contacts sometimes detonate before they can drop a single depth charge. The official after-action reports use careful, bureaucratic language. Torpedo impact during attack approach. Explosion amidships while closing on submerged contact. Loss of vessel during anti-submarine operations. Nobody wants to state the obvious conclusion in writing. Nobody wants to say it directly in briefing rooms. But the whispers spread through the destroyer squadrons. The textbook is killing us. Following doctrine perfectly is getting ships sunk. The logic seems unbreakable. Doctrine says speed and aggression win submarine engagements. Hesitation gives the U-boat time to maneuver, to dive deeper, to escape. Slow approaches let submarines slip away into the vast Atlantic, where they can reposition and strike convoys. Every hour a destroyer wastes trying to be clever is an hour that submarine remains a threat to merchant shipping. The entire defensive system depends on destroyers being aggressive, relentless hunters. But charging straight at every contact is turning those hunters into predictable targets. The ships move at exactly the speed the enemy calculated. They appear at exactly the bearing the enemy anticipated. They present themselves as solutions to a firing problem the submarine commander solved 60 seconds ago. Standard solutions don't fix this because they require capabilities that don't exist in 1943. Some officers suggest developing longer-range anti-submarine weapons. Build depth charges that can strike a U-boat from 5,000 yards instead of 500 yards. Brilliant idea. The technology won't be ready until late 1944, and even then, it remains experimental and unreliable. Others want dramatically improved sonar systems that can differentiate between an actual submarine and a whale, a thermal layer, a sunken wreck, or any of the dozen other things that produce confusing returns. Also brilliant. Also years away from deployment. A few senior planners suggest continuous aircraft support for every convoy crossing the Atlantic. Perfect solution. Except the mid-Atlantic gap stretches roughly 800 miles, beyond the range of land-based patrol aircraft. Escort carriers are being built, but there aren't enough to cover every convoy, and long-range bombers are desperately needed in the Pacific, in North Africa, over Europe. The reality facing destroyer captains in April 1943 is brutal and simple. They have to fight the war with the equipment currently bolted to their decks. They face an enemy who has spent 3 years learning how to kill them, and the approved tactics are becoming death sentences. Morrison is 34 years old in the spring of 1943. He took command of Archer in January after 18 months commanding a minesweeper in the Pacific Theater. His service record is solid but unspectacular. No major commendations, no black marks. He's competent, reliable, and according to some of his crew, perhaps too cautious for the Atlantic knife fight. Destroyer duty in the North Atlantic demands aggressive captains who can make split-second decisions and press attacks without hesitation. Morrison's careful, methodical approach makes some of his officers nervous. What they don't know, what isn't in his official file, is that Morrison spent those 18 months near Guadalcanal watching Japanese destroyers hunt American submarines. He observed patterns. He saw how predictable movement gets exploited. He watched skilled submarine commanders set traps by forcing surface ships to commit to an attack vector, then using that commitment against them. Morrison learned something the hard way in the Pacific. The ocean doesn't care which flag you fly. Physics works identically for everyone. Predictability kills Americans just as efficiently as it kills Japanese. Morrison's idea violates every principle of destroyer doctrine. When you detect a submarine, don't immediately attack. Don't charge straight in like the textbook demands. Instead, create confusion. Make the enemy captain doubt his calculations. Force him to guess. Here's the concept in practical terms. The moment sonar calls a contact, the destroyer turns away from the threat, not toward it. This contradicts every instinct, every training scenario, every lesson drilled into destroyer crews. But Morrison thinks the contradiction is the point. The destroyer increases speed dramatically, but on a bearing that takes it parallel to the suspected submarine position rather than directly at it. Then, after 60 to 90 seconds of high-speed maneuvering, the ship cuts throttle drastically and turns hard in a completely different direction. To the submarine's sonar operator listening through hydrophones, this creates what Morrison calls a fake wake. The initial high-speed turn generates a massive acoustic signature, a roar of propeller noise and hull turbulence that suggests the destroyer is charging aggressively in one specific direction. But the destroyer isn't there anymore. It's somewhere else entirely, moving slower, generating less noise, much harder to track acoustically. If the U-boat captain fired torpedoes at the predicted intercept point based on that initial noise, those weapons are now chasing empty water, while the real target approaches from an unexpected angle. The first time Morrison tries the fake wake maneuver, his executive officer thinks the captain has suffered some kind of breakdown. They have a solid sonar contact 2,800 yards off the starboard bow. The signature looks genuine, probably a Type 7 U-boat based on the acoustic profile. This is exactly the situation destroyer crews train for endlessly. Every other destroyer in the Atlantic Fleet would be racing toward that contact right now. Depth charge racks armed and ready, crew at battle stations preparing to saturate the target area with explosives. Morrison orders hard to port, away from the contact. His XO actually starts to object, mouth opening to question the order. Morrison cuts him off with a look. "We're making noise," he says quietly. "Let him hear us run." Speed increases to 30 knots. Archer's engines howl. The destroyer carves through the Atlantic perpendicular to the threat, opening range instead of closing it. The U-boat could be anywhere now, repositioning for an attack on the convoy they're supposed to be protecting. This is exactly why doctrine demands immediate aggressive response. Then a lookout shouts. Morrison turns. There, 400 yards astern, almost exactly where Archer would have been if Morrison had followed standard procedure and charged straight at the contact. A plume of white water erupts. A torpedo broaches the surface, running out of fuel, its motor still churning uselessly. 12 seconds later, a second plume appears. 2 torpedoes. 2 weapons fired at a firing solution that anticipated textbook destroyer behavior. The U-boat commander calculated where Morrison should have been. Morrison wasn't there. The fake wake worked perfectly. But here's the immediate problem Morrison can't avoid or ignore. By turning away, by refusing to press the attack, he let the submarine escape. Archer didn't sink anything that day. They didn't drop a single depth charge. They didn't even force the U-boat to surface or dive deeper. The enemy vessel is still out there, still operational, still a threat to Allied shipping. When Morrison files his after-action report 3 days later, 3 senior officers summon him for questioning. The session is polite but pointed. One captain notes that Morrison's job is to kill submarines, not merely to survive encounters with them. Another officer points out that if every destroyer in the Atlantic refused to press attacks whenever they felt uncertain, U-boats would slaughter convoys without opposition. The institutional pressure is clear. Destroyers exist to be aggressive. Caution might keep your ship afloat, but it fails the larger mission. Morrison doesn't argue. He doesn't get defensive. He simply asks a question that nobody in the room wants to answer. How many U-boats has the aggressive textbook approach actually sunk in the last 60 days? And how many destroyers has it cost? The senior officers exchange glances. Nobody has those numbers immediately available, or if they do, they're not sharing them in this meeting. But Morrison has done the research. He's read the patrol reports, studied the engagement summaries, talked quietly with other destroyer captains, and the numbers tell an ugly story. Between February and April 1943, Atlantic-based destroyers confirmed 11 U-boat kills through direct depth charge attacks. Confirmed means wreckage recovered, oil slicks verified, or survivors captured. Possible kills and probables don't count in Morrison's calculation. 11 submarines definitely destroyed through aggressive prosecution of sonar contacts. In that same period, the Navy lost 7 destroyers to torpedo attacks, most of them occurring during attack runs against detected submarines. The exchange rate is almost even, 11 kills for 7 losses, except the math isn't actually even when you consider construction timelines and costs. A Fletcher-class destroyer takes approximately 18 months to build from keel laying to commissioning. The price tag runs about $6 million per ship, not counting the cost of training the 300-man crew. A German Type 7 U-boat requires roughly 10 months to build and costs approximately 2 million Reichsmarks, equivalent to about $800,000. Germany is building submarines faster than America is building destroyers. The exchange rate favors the enemy. Something fundamental has to change, or the Atlantic campaign becomes a slow, grinding defeat despite America's industrial advantages. If you've learned something new about naval warfare, smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the tactics that turn the tide of history. Word spreads quietly through the destroyer community, not officially, not through fleet bulletins or training updates, but captains talk to each other during rare port calls. They compare notes over coffee in briefing rooms. They share stories about close calls and near misses. A few destroyer captains start experimenting with variations of Morrison's maneuver. Not all of them. The Navy doesn't officially endorse the fake wake tactic. Doctrine remains unchanged in the official manuals, but convoy operations in the Atlantic are decentralized by necessity. Individual commanders operate hundreds of miles from headquarters. They have latitude to make tactical decisions in the moment. Some captains try Morrison's approach when sonar contacts seem ambiguous, or when something feels wrong about a situation, or when they suspect they're being baited into a trap. Others stick rigidly to doctrine, either because they believe in it or because they fear the career consequences of deviating from approved procedures. The results over the next 3 months are mixed but statistically telling. Between May and July 1943, records indicate that 14 destroyers adopt some version of the fake wake tactic in at least one engagement. Of those 14 ships, only 1 is torpedoed during an attack run against a submarine. That's a loss rate of about 7%. In the same period, 31 destroyers continue using pure aggressive doctrine in every engagement. Of those 31 ships, 6 are hit by torpedoes during attack approaches. That's a loss rate of roughly 19%. The sample size is small enough that statisticians would urge caution about drawing firm conclusions. But the survival rate for ships using the fake wake method is measurably better. And destroyer captains start noticing something else, a secondary effect Morrison didn't anticipate. U-boats that expect a predictable charge sometimes stay submerged longer when the expected attack doesn't materialize. They burn battery power trying to reacquire the target, trying to understand what the destroyer is doing. That extended submersion makes them easier to locate later, easier to track, easier to corner when additional ships arrive. Let's be completely clear about what this tactic doesn't accomplish. It doesn't guarantee submarine kills. Morrison's Archer doesn't sink a confirmed U-boat until August 1943, and even that success comes as part of a coordinated attack involving 2 other American destroyers and a British corvette. The fake wake maneuver is fundamentally defensive, not offensive. It keeps your ship alive long enough to fight smarter, to wait for support, to choose better engagement conditions. But in the context of 1943 Atlantic warfare, that defensive capability matters enormously. A destroyer that survives today can rejoin the convoy tomorrow, escort another crossing next week, train another generation of officers next month. A destroyer resting in pieces on the ocean floor helps nobody. The innovation isn't about glory or impressive kill counts. It's about staying in the war long enough to win it through cumulative advantage. There's resistance to Morrison's method, serious institutional resistance. Some destroyer captains call it cowardice, either privately or in official communications. They argue that turning away from the enemy violates every principle of naval combat dating back centuries. One particularly vocal commander circulates a memo through destroyer squadron headquarters pointing out that Morrison's approach would have been absolutely unthinkable in the age of sail, when warships closed to gun range and fought it out broadside to broadside. Retreat was dishonor. Evasion was failure. He's not wrong about naval tradition, but the age of sail didn't have acoustic homing torpedoes. It didn't have sonar allowing submarines to track targets from 4,000 yards away. It didn't have underwater vessels capable of diving to 600 feet and firing salvos from positions no surface ship could reach. Naval warfare changed fundamentally in the 20th century. Doctrine has to change with it, has to adapt to new weapons and new threat profiles, or it becomes a suicide pact dressed up in the language of honor and tradition. By September 1943, Allied anti-submarine warfare starts to shift dramatically across multiple dimensions. But the change isn't solely because of the fake wake tactic. Long-range B-24 Liberator bombers finally closed the mid-Atlantic gap, providing air coverage over areas previously beyond any land-based aircraft. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built on merchant ship hulls, start bringing aviation support directly to convoys. Improved sonar systems with better resolution begin reaching frontline destroyers. Radar technology advances, making surfaced submarines easier to detect at night. Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars enter service, allowing destroyers to attack submerged contacts without passing directly over the target, reducing vulnerability during the attack run. The entire system evolves simultaneously. Technology, tactics, training, coordination all improve together. But here's what the survival records suggest happened. Destroyer losses drop sharply in the final months of 1943. In the last 4 months of 1943, only 2 American destroyers are sunk by U-boat torpedoes during active attack runs in the Atlantic theater. Compare that to 11 destroyers lost in the first 4 months of the year. Some of that improvement comes from better technology finally reaching the fleet. Some comes from Germany's submarine force being ground down, with experienced crews killed and replaced by hastily trained replacements. But some portion of the improvement, a portion difficult to quantify precisely, comes from the fake wake method, spreading informally through the destroyer community. Captains who survive using the tactic teach it to other captains. Crews who see it work adopt it in their own engagements. The evolution happens below the level of official doctrine, spreading through the fleet as practical survival knowledge rather than approved procedure. Morrison himself stays in the Atlantic until January 1944, running convoy escort missions throughout the fall. Then the Navy transfers him to the Pacific Theater for the island-hopping campaigns. He takes command of a different destroyer, participating in shore bombardment operations and carrier screen duty. The threats change. Instead of submarines, he faces kamikaze attacks, shore batteries, and surface engagements during the Philippines campaign. Morrison survives the war. Archer survives the war. The destroyer is decommissioned in 1946, part of the massive drawdown as the Navy shrinks from wartime to peacetime manning levels. Archer sits in reserve for several years, then gets reactivated for the Korean War, serving as a training vessel and coastal patrol ship. Finally scrapped in 1972 after 30 years of service. No monuments commemorate Archer. No medals specifically recognize Morrison's tactical innovation. Just a hull number in the registry and a collection of after-action reports filed away in archives. A captain who understood that survival is the prerequisite for victory and a ship that lived long enough to prove the point. Here's the deeper lesson that echoes across every tactical evolution in military history. Doctrine exists for legitimate reasons. It captures hard-won experience from previous conflicts. It gives inexperienced crews a framework to follow when chaos erupts and there's no time for creative thinking. It ensures baseline competence across large organizations where individual skill levels vary wildly. But doctrine is also inherently backward-looking. It's built from the last war, the last engagement, the last generation of technology. It codifies what worked before. And enemies study your doctrine just as carefully as your own forces do, perhaps more carefully because their survival depends on exploiting your predictability. The moment a tactic becomes completely predictable, it becomes exploitable. The German U-boat captains who fired torpedoes at where American destroyers would be weren't tactical geniuses. They were competent professionals who recognized a pattern and used it. They did exactly what any capable enemy does when faced with predictable opposition. The American destroyer captains who broke that pattern weren't cowards or mavericks. They were survivors who understood that adaptability beats consistency when the enemy has learned your playbook. Think about the human numbers one more time. 2,800 Allied merchant ships lost by April 1943. That's not just steel and cargo. That's roughly 30,000 merchant sailors killed, drowned in freezing water, or burned in fuel fires, or crushed in explosions. 43 American destroyers and escorts sunk in the Atlantic. That's approximately 12,900 naval personnel, trained crews who took 18 months to train and can't be replaced quickly. 11 U-boat kills versus 7 destroyer losses in a 3-month period. Those aren't abstract statistics for staff officers to analyze. They're fuel that didn't reach Britain, ammunition that didn't reach North Africa, soldiers who never made it to Europe. Every innovation that improved those numbers, even slightly, even marginally, saved lives in quantities impossible to calculate precisely. The fake wake method probably saved dozens of ships over the course of late 1943 and 1944. Maybe a few hundred sailors who would have died in torpedo explosions got to go home instead. We'll never know exactly how many because the ships that didn't explode don't generate dramatic reports. Survival is quiet. Success is measured in the absence of disaster. And here's the impossible trade-off Morrison never escaped, the burden he carried for the rest of his career. Every time he used the fake wake maneuver, every time he turned away instead of charging directly at a sonar contact, there was a measurable chance the U-boat escaped. A submarine that survived Morrison's caution could reposition and sink merchant ships the next day, the next week, the next month. How do you measure that? How do you balance the destroyer you saved against the freighter full of aviation fuel that might get torpedoed because you didn't press an attack? Morrison made the calculation that a living destroyer could hunt again, could learn from each engagement, could adapt to changing enemy tactics. A dead destroyer was just 2,000 tons of steel on the ocean floor, helping nobody, protecting nothing. But the weight of that choice, the knowledge that defensive tactics might impose costs on other ships and other crews, that's the burden every tactical innovator carries. You can't prove the counterfactual. You can't know what would have happened if you'd chosen differently. The fake wake method didn't win the Battle of the Atlantic. No single tactic ever wins a campaign that complex, that sprawling, that dependent on industrial production and cryptography and logistics and weather and 1,000 other variables. But Morrison's innovation contributed to a larger shift in how Allied navies thought about submarine warfare. It validated the idea that unpredictability could function as a weapon in itself, that making the enemy guess was sometimes more valuable than making the enemy fight under conditions that favored him. That survival and patience could create better opportunities than courage and aggression. By late 1944, American destroyer doctrine officially incorporated variable attack approaches into training manuals. The textbook finally caught up to what Morrison figured out in April 1943 through observation and logic. That's how tactical innovation works in war. Slowly, painfully, written in the survival of ships that should have died and didn't, preserved in after-action reports that bureaucrats file away, spread through informal networks of officers who trust each other enough to share dangerous ideas. April 1945. 2 years after Morrison's first fake wake maneuver, the Atlantic U-boat threat is collapsing under combined pressure. Germany has lost over 600 submarines since 1939, including roughly 200 in the last year alone. The hunters have become the hunted. Allied destroyers roam in coordinated groups, using tactics the Germans can't predict and technology they can't match. Submarines that surface get attacked by aircraft. Submarines that stay submerged get tracked by improved sonar and destroyed by Hedgehog mortars. The tactical equation has completely reversed. Morrison is in the Pacific now, off Okinawa, where his destroyer provides anti-aircraft screening for carriers during the massive invasion. The threat isn't submarines anymore, it's kamikazes. Japanese pilots deliberately crashing explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. Different enemy, different doctrine, different ocean, but the same underlying truth applies. The side that adapts fastest survives longest. The side that learns from experience and changes tactics accordingly wins eventually. Picture this final image. Archer in 1946, tied up at a Philadelphia Navy Yard dock, waiting for decommissioning. The war is over. Japan surrendered. Germany is occupied rubble. The massive wartime fleet is being mothballed as quickly as bureaucracy allows. Archer's paint is faded from years of salt spray. The depth charge racks are empty and will never be loaded again. Somewhere in a records office in Washington, there's a folder with Morrison's after-action reports from 1943. The reports where he turned away from contacts instead of charging directly at them. The reports where he made tremendous noise and then went silent. The reports where he sent enemy torpedoes chasing empty water while his ship maneuvered from an unexpected angle. Nobody reading those files in 1946 thinks they're revolutionary documents. They're just paperwork, standard operational reports filed by a competent officer. But data is how lessons survive between wars, how the next generation learns without paying the full price in blood, how the next conflict gets fought a little bit smarter because someone wrote down what worked and what didn't. The fake wake method wasn't elegant. It wasn't the kind of tactical brilliance that gets taught at naval academies as a perfect example of maritime warfare. It wasn't heroic in the traditional sense. It didn't involve new technology or massive resource investment or complex coordination between multiple platforms. It was just a captain who paid attention to patterns, who remembered what he learned in a different ocean against a different enemy, who decided that doctrine was a tool to be used intelligently rather than a religious text to be followed blindly. And that decision, multiplied across a dozen ships, sustained over months of brutal convoy warfare, implemented by captains who trusted their judgment more than their training manuals, kept enough destroyers alive to make a measurable difference in the Atlantic campaign. There's a final number worth considering. By the end of World War II, the United States Navy had commissioned 175 Fletcher-class destroyers. These ships served in every theater, fought in every major campaign, escorted countless convoys, screened carrier groups, bombarded beaches, hunted submarines, and rescued downed pilots. Of those 175 destroyers, 19 were lost to enemy action during the entire war. That's a survival rate of approximately 89% for one of the most dangerous jobs in the Navy. How much of that survival rate comes from better tactics like the fake wake method? Impossible to say with precision. But tactics matter. Learning matters. The willingness to question doctrine when doctrine stops working matters. Those 156 destroyers that survived carried home roughly 46,800 sailors who might have died if their captains had been less flexible, less willing to adapt, less capable of recognizing when the enemy had learned their patterns. Morrison retired from the Navy in 1957 as a captain, having served through 2 wars in the tense early years of the Cold War. He never wrote a book about his experiences. He never gave interviews about the fake wake tactic. He was a professional naval officer who did his job competently and went home when it was over. Exactly the kind of person innovation actually comes from most of the time. Not dramatic heroes or brilliant mavericks, but careful observers who notice patterns, trust their analysis, and implement changes despite institutional resistance. The people who survive wars often aren't the bravest or the most aggressive. They're the ones who learned fastest. So here's the question for you. The question every military organization faces in every conflict. When faced with an enemy that has learned your playbook, studied your doctrine, and adapted to exploit your predictability, what matters more? Sticking to proven procedures that provide consistency and tradition, or risking an unproven adaptation that might save lives but might also fail catastrophically? There's no perfect answer. Morrison's approach worked in the North Atlantic in 1943 under specific conditions against a specific enemy. It might have failed completely in different circumstances, but the willingness to question, to adapt, to try something different when the standard approach is getting people killed, that willingness is what separates organizations that learn from organizations that die. Drop your answer in the comments. Would you have turned away like Morrison or charged in like doctrine demanded?